Hello, welcome to Zachipedia, and today we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment philosophers, as well as, just for reference, some pre- and post-Enlightenment philosophers who are relevant to the time period. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher and author who, in his most notable work, Leviathan, published in the early 1600s, advocated for the idea that society and its adjoining concepts, so the idea of the social hierarchy, social structuralism, the greater structure of society, the idea of division of labor, the idea of status of people and wealth and economic classes, etc., were actually positives that helped keep people centralized and in a specific form that was, as he said, civilized and cordial. Moreover, he believed that pre-societal or non-societal humanity, so the hunter-gatherers or Native American tribes or etc., were uncivilized, as he put it, and that whoever lacked society essentially lacked the natural peace and order that would keep people in line and would keep people in a positive route with the course to their life. And he advocated for this specifically with absolutist political ideals. So, for example, he advocated for the ideas of monarchy, dictatorship, authoritarianism, etc., to keep people in line, and that higher authority should actually oppress the people to ensure that they acted as they should within what was acceptable in society. One of his most famous quotes was, "Life is nasty, brutish, and short." Essentially, him describing a non-societal human structure, which he believed was disorderly and uncivilized. René Descartes was a French mathematician, philosopher, and overall thinker who was actually one of the most critical contributors, not just Western philosophy, but to the beginning stages of the Enlightenment itself. Essentially, he brought up many new concepts, the ideas of more modern forms of geometry and mathematics with the Cartesian plane, or just as we use in today's terms, coordinate plane, in which we have axes and 4 quadrants, and geometric transformations, in which shapes would go from page or side to side or quadrant to quadrant, as well as he came up with the idea of deductive reasoning and the use of going from the abstract to the concrete, the idea of going from more general, broad details or a general, broad idea, perception, or circumstance, and essentially singling all of that out with the use of logic to one specific, succinct question or conclusion. Furthermore, he also came up with the philosophical idea of dualism, in which he believed that the natural world could be understood in 2 main ways, through the physical and through the spiritual. The physical being what we can observe, we can measure, and we can physically, visually comprehend, and the spiritual being more of the universal forces that guide us, that we can feel, but we can't exactly understand or know. This is what inspired his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," which essentially means, in his perspective, that if you can think, if you can observe, if you can understand, or at least have a perception of the world, you do exist and your conscience is justified. Sir Francis Bacon was an English nobleman and philosopher who first proposed the mainstream the idea of using inductive reasoning, or as he called it, empiricism, in which one has a very specific question and then eventually, through process, they develop upon it, and through experimentation, through observation, and through the collection of data, they get more general details that answer or give multiple explanations to that initial question. Furthermore, he came up with the idea of the scientific method, as well as various steps of experimentation, experimentalism, and simply operating one's life in a way that's mechanical. Chisari Pacaya was one of the most critical Enlightenment philosophers with regards to the idea of modern criminal justice and the court system, as well as the application of law in society. Essentially, he first proposed to the mainstream the concept of ending cruel or unusual punishment, and that essentially prisoners should have the right to be punished or receive consequences not based on some archival medieval practices like torture or beheading or the removal of organs, but rather one that suited the degree or level of crime they possessed, such as an extended prison sentence, probation, suspension, or various ideas, as well as the fact that their social class should not necessarily impact to what degree the punishment should be received at. German philosopher Immanuel Kant was one of the most critical thinkers of the Enlightenment, especially since he existed in the later period of the Enlightenment. Specifically, he advocated for various things that redefined our understanding of the natural world. Essentially, that morality and the concept of morals are based off of rationality, that we act good and do things that are good for the community, not just for the benefit of others, but also because there's a strategic or self-fulfilling portion that is beneficial to us, which is why it satisfies our need for survival, our quest for survival that we naturally possess. He also developed upon the philosophical notion first proposed by John Locke that basically the human mind is developed not by birth or individual essence that is created at birth, but rather human experience, and that our experiences and the way in which we act, our personality, is based upon what we have done. Furthermore, he also proposed the notion that morality is relative, and the idea of relative morality or categorized morality, which is basically that immoral actions may be moral or moral actions may be immoral, depending on the circumstance. So for example, if you don't shoot a killer because you believe that violence is immoral, you are essentially acting immorally because you're allowing that person, that killer, to kill a victim. Or vice versa. If you kill someone who could possibly do so much good because he committed one bad action, then you are essentially being immoral as well. Or you could be moral by not killing someone who is super evil, who did one evil thing and is going to do so many more positive moral things. Denis Diderot was a notable philosopher and scholar who first published a novel, or moreover, a compendium of novels and information called the Encyclopedia in French, which, as the name implies, was actually one of the first collections of knowledge and information accessible to the public. It's actually creating one of the first modern encyclopedias, or books containing knowledge and current events of the time period and of past history. However, it is most revered for at the time being ahead of its time with regards to atheism, as he directly implied in the book, as well as with his own personal beliefs, that there was no God and that only empirical data could justify its existence. Baruch Spinoza was a Dutch philosopher and polymath who first proposed the idea of pantheism, a bit of an eccentric, diverse approach, not just religion, but how we perceive the world and how humans understand the natural world in general. He specifically was the first person to propose the idea that humans and people controlled their own consciousness, and that their perception was not caused by some kind of outer force, such as God or religion, but that people's individual perception was all on them. That the way they viewed the world was based on their personality and their individual understanding. He also was the creator of essentially a long line of philosophers, both in the Enlightenment period and after, who proposed the idea of centralism or connectivism, or whatever term any of them used at the time or in the future, which essentially described that all concepts in nature were essentially connected in some way, and that if you described them and went into their specifics enough, there would be a middle point or a ground point in which they would all intersect, and that all the concepts that were ever created by humanity were simply in this gigantic web that, as I previously just stated, were all connected. English philosopher and political reformer John Locke was one of the most important figures of the early Enlightenment and is considered by many historians to be one of the primary kickstarters of the entire intellectual movement. Essentially, he first proposed some of the major ideas of liberty, of individual rights, and the idea of one's control over themselves. Specifically, he proposed the three inalienable rights, the ideas of life, liberty, and property, and that these three critical, fundamental human rights cannot be taken away from any person. Well, at least any person that was considered part of the British Constitution or British sovereign, as of course, unfortunately, slaves were excluded from this principle. Also, one of the primary crafters of the English Bill of Rights, which was one of the first and earliest constitutions in the Western world that guaranteed more individual rights to the people. And another philosophical concept he brought up was the idea of tabula rasa, or which is Latin for blank slate. And he essentially brought up the principle that humans are born blank slates. They're born without any knowledge or understanding of the natural world, and basically that slate gets carved into as they grow, develop, and gain experiences. French writer, philosopher, and social critic Voltaire is one of the most recognizable names of the Enlightenment and of intellectualism in general. And, to be fair, for good reason, as essentially he first proposed the solid concept of liberty, or the idea that people have the right to do whatever they want to themselves as long as it doesn't affect others, and moreover, that people have the right to essentially keep their values to themselves and not impose their values on anyone else, therefore allowing for full freedom and the idea that everyone is entitled to their own beliefs, their own rights, and their own statements. Furthermore, this led to the ideas of him supporting separation of church and state, him supporting more representative democracy, and the idea of people having control of their own governments, and his staunch criticisms of the monarchy, of governments, and just of the social structure in general. He was also a notable founder of the general concept of social dissent, or that essentially people should have the right to basically just dedicate entire papers, novels, and pamphlets to criticizing a specific aspect of society, not necessarily to propose a solution or to play it into the greater theme of what it was supporting, but just to criticize the entire system in general, a concept that made him very controversial himself, especially amongst the church, amongst governments, and amongst just the people. Many people who viewed him to be far too risque. And on the topic of risque, Voltaire was known for popularizing the idea of subjectivity and wit into writing and even just serious general conversation and discourse, as he liked to put jokes, amusement, or little witticisms or stylings of the specific things that he wrote or said to make it more relevant, to make people more interested and intrigued, and to solidify a specific point. Now, without a doubt, one of the most important Enlightenment philosophers was another Frenchman by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was essentially the father of the notion of popular sovereignty, or majority rules, which basically stated that the majority of the population should essentially have what they want. Whatever the majority wants, the majority should get. And this played to his idea of representative democracy, of referendum, of whatever the majority of the people voted for in an election should essentially be enacted. Moreover, he also advocated, from this concept, the idea that people should essentially sacrifice some of their individual liberties or beliefs for the common good. So, for example, the way in which Rousseau acted upon this would have been traffic lights or traffic laws, in which basically Cars might briefly be forced to stop, and people might have to halt their pursuits of happiness to get to a specific destination to stop for the red light and then wait for the green light to go. But this is to make sure that a comprehensive system that prevents people from crashing into each other, especially in the bustle and chaos of everyday life, is put in place to make sure that this system prevents major suffering and catastrophe. All of these ideas were in his most notable work called The Social Contract, which many of the values of that book played into another philosophy in which he countered the beliefs of another notable philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes and his book Leviathan, as we previously mentioned, in which Rousseau advocated for the idea that society was not a good thing, that the social hierarchy, the social structure, a centralized oppressive force keeping people within the constraints of civilization, and the idea of division of labor and people stressing within the confines of society was not positive, that it made people violent, brutal, greedy, overly emotional, and destructive, and that moreover, premature humans, or more of a primitive humans, back from before society was established, back such as when it came to the tribal period, or previous examples of a quote-unquote uncivilized group of humanity, were actually a lot happier and better because they were only living to complete their basic function of life, survival, and they were not affected by the ideas of recreation or the ideas of being trapped into the stressful confines of a society. And essentially, he believed that the original state of humans, just to live in nature, was what they were designed for, and that keeping people within the constraints, strictures, and confines of society was a negative and made people more hostile and aggressive. So that basically wraps up today's lesson about the basic philosophical minds of the Enlightenment. I hope it enlightened you a little. Yeah, that was way too corny. So yeah, have a nice weekend. Enjoy yourselves.